オイラが有名になったらみんなを助手にしてやってもいいぜ。
私強くなりますから。
Yeah, that didn't work out all too well for you now, did it, dude? And yes, my headcanon is that Batamonda is actually Hiko Yuzi's disguise forte. I mean, come on, their personalities aren't that far off. But yeah, for today, I wanted to talk about one of the few games I recently completed and enjoyed for the most part, and how the current Precure series could learn from it. Yes, this is going to be another one of those videos where I will complain about a specific problematic element of the current show and how it might affect the overall quality of it going forward. And yeah, while I stand by my opinion that Amane was a botched Sixth Ranger and that Delicious Party overall was just not that great of a series, I do think that Hirogaru Sky Precure has a slightly bigger fundamental issue. Don't get me wrong, I still like this show, and do believe that it will still be overall better than Delicious Party, but I also don't think it'll end up being the home run that this Reiwa era of Precure has desperately needed from a financial and critical standpoint. Case in point, while I also think Cure Majesty hasn't excelled as a great Sixth Ranger in terms of her arc so far, I think she's ultimately just a symptom of a much bigger issue that, as of the time of this writing and recording, the show has failed to fully address. That being its world building and antagonists, which, yeah, I do consider to be a bit intertwined with each other. They could be individual issues for a show, but often I do think that they correlate with each other. After all, by their very nature in being hostile and often starting the main conflicts of their shows, antagonists will often be the characters who affect their worlds the most. Thus, if it's decided from the onset that one will receive less focus and development, the other will often follow suit, which is the definite case for Hirogaru Sky so far. Conversely, and much like its spiritual predecessor, I think Master Detective's Archive, Raincode, has a fantastic setting and antagonists that fully intertwine with each other. How did they accomplish this, and how could Hero Sky have pulled off something similar? Well, get your raincoat and or umbrella drones ready as we go to Kanai Ward and check out its peacekeepers who kinda put the literal skinhead to shame. FYI, we will try to keep the spoilers for both Raincoat and Danganronpa to a minimum, but there will be some minor spoilers for both, so just be aware. Anyway though, let's just get right into it. First, a little introduction to this game and where it came from. Raincoat was an adventure game released on the Nintendo Switch earlier this year as a new IP from the still relatively new Japanese game developer 2Kyo Games. The company is founded by former Spike Chunsoft employees, including writer Kazutaka Kodaka, composer Masafumi Takada, and illustrator Rui Komatsu Zuaki, all of whom were of Danganronpa fame while working at Spike Chun. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, then you'll know that I was a bit of a fan of the Danganronpa visual novel franchise, and that I also had a bit of a falling out with it. Specifically, the series lost me with the Danganronpa 3 anime, which was just a mess of a show that, in my opinion, acted as a poor conclusion to the original Hope's Peak Academy trilogy. Thus, I also did skip out on V3, which proceeded to further needlessly deconstruct the original trilogy. It's a shame because I really did like the first two games and the setting and antagonists they had created. Of course, Monokuma became an incredibly iconic mascot villain for his hilarious antics and trolley killing games, and yet, the thing that really caught my attention by the end of the second game was the true main antagonist that wasn't even really the mastermind behind Monokuma, but rather the setting of Hope's Peak Academy. Yeah, for me, Kodaka managed to expertly craft the school into a character in of itself, as while the mastermind of the original two games had ignited the original conflict that led to the whole world falling apart, it only really became as bad as it was thanks to this school that had gained too much political influence as it placed heavy emphasis on crafting literal ultimate beings who could supposedly better humanity. Over the course of the games, the player would come to realize how much pressure this totalitarian academy ends up placing on its students who often just want to prove their worth to either themselves or their loved ones. It's a toxic educational system that unfortunately isn't that much different than real life facilities in our world. Yeah, another thing I really like about Kodaka's writing is how it does weave in some unfortunately timeless social issues, as broken educational systems will be a forever problem. And it was through this broken system that the mastermind managed to throw the world into despair, which was then ruined by the explanations in the anime, which, on top of just being a trope that I do not like at all, it also was just something that did need to be explained, really. Yeah, while world building can be important, it also helps to just leave some things ambiguous or mysteriful, as that in of itself can add to the world. Thus, for me personally, Danganronpa ended with the second game, and Ultra Despair goes. That for me leaves it with a satisfying conclusion, with the defeat of both the mastermind and the downfall of Hope's Peak Academy's broken system. We bring this all up both as a bit of a topper to my original Danganronpa videos, as well as to highlight how its successor would end up carrying on all of its major themes and ideas. Raincoat takes place in the Kanai ward, a city where the news never includes a weather report, as every day is rainy. And while there is a certain plot reason for the constant showers, it was also decided early into the game's design to have it be a permanent fixture in order to give the city more of a cyberpunk feel. Most notably, how the water distorts the neon lights of the city in a clear homage to works like Blade Runner. And on that note, when you're dealing with cyberpunk, there are certain narratives that are pretty much constant through all of them. Stuff like nihilism, the loss of humanity, and most notably for this city, the corruption of governmental and industrial institutions. Yeah, like many cyberpunk settings, it is full-on dystopian, with the city being an autonomous zone being run by one big mega-corporation known as Amaterasu, named ironically after the Japanese sun deity. I'm guessing, in story, they try to portray themselves as the light in the darkness of this constantly cloudy city, but that could not be further from the truth. As the company's personal security force, the Peacekeepers acted as a self-governed law enforcement. And unfortunately, there were no Dreads or Alex Murphys amongst their ranks, as pretty much all of them were corrupt. They were well aware of the fact that the city needed the financial backings of their company, so they flaunted it by completely inverting the usual Miranda rights. Yes, it's on the nose as all hell, but it's still an effective way of getting across how corrupt these keepers of the peace really were. Oh, come on, that's just ridiculous. I mean, what sort of company would force their customers to have an unhealthy dependence on them, as well as try to create their own self-governed area where they could avoid a lot of their country's regulations and taxes? Yeah, again, Kodaka's writing kind of hits a little bit too close to home. As for why the citizens didn't just move out of this clear hellhole, or at least try to tank the company by not buying from Amaterasu, and oh god, I just realized the pun there. Well, there was another spoilery plot reason behind it that ties into the ultimate secret of Kanai Ward, which the player character of Yuma Kokohead, a trainee detective, was supposed to uncover, on top of solving several smaller unresolved cases in-game. Yeah, adding to the oppressive atmosphere of the setting, Kanai Ward had a ton of cold case files, with many remaining on ice either due to the incompetence of the Peacekeepers, or more often, just full-on cover-ups that helped to line their own pockets. As a result, the citizens were under constant pressure, coming from either fear that someone related to Amaterasu might throw them under the bus, or frustrations knowing that they just didn't have a reliable police force. Some understandably cracked under this pressure, either giving into psychosis or desperately trying to find ways out of this awful city. Kanai Ward might not be the most innovative cyberpunk, as we've already made the comparisons with Blade Runner and Judge Dredd, but at least it was one that I could play through without having to worry about 1,000,001 different glitches. While every chapter of the game featured a different antagonist that Yuma had to deal with, there were two baddies who had a presence throughout most of the game. Yomi Hellsmile, the director of the Peacekeepers, and Makoto Kakutsuchi, the CEO of Amaterasu. And while the latter was technically responsible for a lot of Kanai Ward's bigger conspiracies and had a lot of shitty agendas planned out for Yuma, he was nowhere near as actively antagonistic as the dude who's just straight up named Hellsmile.
最後に聞きたいんだけどよ。愛ってなんだ？
Kito did not take getting dumped by Asuna all that well. Seriously, am I the only one who thinks Yoshitsugu Matsuoka's voice is better suited as a hammy villain than a stereotypical shonen protagonist? Well, anyway, this dude is nothing short of a complete monster, pretty much responsible for all of the corruption in Kanai Ward. just a sociopath who sought power through tyranny, believing that it was only natural that someone as truly charming as him should control everything. As a result, Yomi was not at all a complex character, and yet thanks to the effective world building of Kanai Ward, we were able to just see the damage his machinations had caused. To me, the sign of a good villain is one whose very presence could sow discord into the setting, and then have the two story elements build off of each other. Again, not a fleshed out character, but when a dude is this legit terrifying and maintains a significant influence on the world around him, characterization kind of becomes overrated. Makoto also has significant influence on Kanai Ward, being the one who pretty much owned the city, but was far less malicious. He's still absolutely qualified as an antagonist, as while nowhere near as actively destructive as Yomi, his actions were still very morally gray at best. As a result, he did also often butt heads with Yomi, who of course coveted his position at the literal top of the city. This led to some pretty engaging interactions between the main antagonists of this game. Something kind of lackey in Hirogaru's Sky, but we'll get to that in just a bit. Anyway, another thing Makoto did great was act as a strong foil for Yuma. As the detective of the story, he was of course trying to uncover the secrets of Kanai Ward, which were mostly being hidden by Makoto. And without going too much into spoilers, he did honestly believe what he was doing was for the greater good. Which was naturally in opposition to Yuma's "the truth will set you free" philosophy, leading to the two eventually clashing, all for the sake of doing what they thought was best for the city of the Endless Rain. To me, Raincoat is a great story and game that you really should check out if you haven't already. Sure, it's not perfect, as some of the actual game mechanics are needlessly frustrating, and some of the climax is rushed, but still well worth checking out if you're at all interested in mysteries and or cyberpunk. If anything, you could end up learning a thing or two about how to write a good and engaging conflict, which conveniently leads us into our main subject of this little video essay, and its severe lack of one. Hirogaru Sky Precure's villains and settings certainly didn't start off bad. I mean, from the first episode, we did get a good look at Skyland, and at least got an idea of what the Undargu Empire's goals were. Which honestly, for a Precure series, is more than adequate. Yeah, just for clarification, I will say there really shouldn't be a one-to-one comparison of this show and Raincode. One is a Sunday morning anime with the target audience of little girls, and the other is an M-rated game meant for, gentlemen. And other than maybe Behold Sky, which is on a bit of a different level, the world building of Precure has never been the greatest, and that's been fine. I mean, even the most snobbish and annoying critics who review the show aren't here for a rich lore or anything, and do mostly watch for the kick-ass magical girls. But, by that same token, if the bar has been set that low, then we should only expect them to be able to easily overcome it, rather than end up tripping all over themselves. Guess what Hirogaru Sky does? I would say some of the earliest cracks in this anime started to show in episode 6, when after his biggest defeat and subsequent dressing down by his boss, the first evil general Kabuto remained the recurring villain. Now, I actually didn't mind this at first, as I did like the character, but by the final episode of his arc, it did feel like he had really overstayed his welcome, as he had been the only real villain of the show for the first 12 episodes, and no, I don't count the Kaiserin, as she didn't really interact with the Precure, and hardly at all with her underling. And that's the thing, not only did the villains hardly interact with each other, but they also didn't interact with their homeworld at all. Yeah, even though Skyland has gotten an okayish amount of development so far, I mean, I do have issues with how it was presented that we might go over more in an eventual series overview. Ultimately, it was only one half of the world of this show. Specifically, they only focused on the light, even though the darkness also kind of needs that spotlight. Going back to Raincoat for a minute, Kanai Ward was unquestionably the den of the peacekeepers and their corruption. By emphasizing the effect they had on the innocent residents of the city, it really helped to elevate the urgency of the situation that Yuma and the Nocturnal Detective Agency needed to resolve. Conversely, at least for over half the series at this point, the threat of the Empire on Skyland has felt rather minimal. At best, we were told they had caused some significant damage in the past, and Batamonda did manage to put the king and queen into comas, but even the latter point was resolved with no real issues by the end of the arc.
Barely an inconvenience.
This wasn't helped by the fact that generals like Batamonda and Kabuto were just kind of haphazardly shuffled off in order to make room for the next baddie. Now, to be fair, this is also a bit of an issue with Raincold, specifically in regards to the peacekeepers Swine Consonal and Gilum Hall.
金なら奪ったものをここに出せ。そうすれば金だけは助けてやる。
Well, glad to see Bumpy found work after Karasa didn't work out, though maybe he should have skipped out on a few of those Kira sweets. But yeah, both characters just kind of acted as the arc villains of the 0th and 3rd chapters respectively, and then just kind of disappeared for the rest of the game. And to Hirogaru Sky's credit, it does seem like they're going to bring both of these guys back soon. However, it does seem like they're not going to serve as major antagonists anymore, not that they did that much in the grand scheme of things. And that's been the big issue with this show, ineffective villains, especially in regards to the world around them. Now, of course, this might change with the introduction of Skeerhead, who at least comes off as a somewhat intimidating villain who could one-shot the protagonist and does take his job very seriously. But even then, they've also done very little to build up the empire he works for, and therefore, we can't really get a good sense of how huge of a threat they pose. Like, let's just drop Raincold for a second and compare this more with their contemporaries. At the same time we were reviewing the series, we also did a series review for the OG Futari series. And while I do think they were going through some natural growing pains at the time, the threat of the villain faction, the Dotsuku Zone, was palatable. They had effectively destroyed the Garden of Light, and even after it was restored midway into the series, Jar King's dark shadow could still be felt looming over it for his inevitable return. Viewers knew something bad was coming, as not only did the Precure discuss it, but so did the villains themselves. Scenes like this, while somewhat repetitive, as they did often repeat a lot of points in regards to their king's instability, did still raise the threat levels, and even gave characterization to these baddies, to the point that we would understand why the Dark Seeds in the second half of the series would end up betraying their superior for their own sakes. Sound familiar? And yet, for whatever reason, they decided to forgo any scenes of the villains interacting with each other for this season. Yeah, while I still think some focus test grouping was involved, as they seemed to use feedback from theatergoers who had seen the latest Precure films at the time, based on some interviews, it does seem like it was a bit more of a conscious decision by head writer Ryunosuke Kingetsu and chief director Koji Ogawa to forgo villain interactions and place more focus on just the protagonist. Which, if it was entirely their call, then all I can say is, I'm just disappointed. Like, if you think scenes of villains interacting with each other in previous seasons were not well received with the viewers, then maybe, just maybe, that had more to do with the fact that y'all had made some pretty boring villains, or in the case of Tropical Rouge, also didn't capitalize on some interesting world building, and a twist villain that they could have had for the final arc of that series. Yeah, I know I keep bringing this up, but I just can't wrap my brain around the fact that they revealed so many shocking truths about how the Grand Ocean of that show had manipulated the minds of their very citizens in order to maintain isolationism from the rest of the world. That's actually not too dissimilar to the plot of Raincold, and yet it pretty much went nowhere. And you know, I think I know why. Okay, so tinfoil hat theorizing again, so do take this with a heavy grain of salt, but I do wonder if Toei has just kind of gotten cold feet when it comes to addressing some heavier subject matter these days. Like, I'm not saying they have to go edgy and grimdark, and again, certainly not to Raincold's level, but looking at the patterns after Healing Good, I do feel like Toei has gotten cold feet when it comes to deeper themes, like commenting on governments, or at least some more gray moralities. Like, again, even though the Dotsuku Zone were kind of basic villains to start off the franchise with, they did also have layers to them. All of the generals were ultimately just fighting for their survival, knowing that their fates lied in the hands of their king. And when they couldn't handle this fact, they rebelled for selfless and selfish reasons between Kirya and the Dark Seas respectively. Meanwhile, with the Ondargu Empire, I'm still not quite sure what their motivations are as a faction, as even their leader remains literally faceless as of the time of this writing, which also conveniently makes it easier to simply label the Kaiserin as pure evil, rather than being able to dig any deeper into her and her world. For all their talk about this show having a bunch of firsts for this franchise, like first blue lead, first male cure, first adult cure, first baby cure, they ended up with antagonists and a world that feel even less developed than even their OG series. In fact, bringing back Bumpy for a minute, he appeared in 3 TV seasons and worked for 3 different evil conglomerates. Each one, especially Nightmare, acted as some rather scathing commentary about Japan's toxic work culture, which is unfortunately still very much a thing, especially in entertainment. And sure, kids won't get some of this stuff immediately, but it still added layers to these shows and made them memorable, hence why the Yes seasons are getting a sequel next month. To top it all off, this sort of darker social commentary would not feel out of place in Danganronpa with their themes of high societal expectations driving the youth into despair, and of course Rain Code and their evil conglomerate, which yeah, maybe there actually are a few more one-to-one comparisons we could make with these properties. The point that we're trying to get across is that it's just kind of baffling to me that they would stray so far away from properly developing the villains of a show where one of the main themes that's even in the title is heroes. While again, there are some things that we do want to say for the eventual overview, I'll say right now that they're ultimately devaluing the show's very premise by not having the antagonist have a stronger presence for over half of its run, as without it, the show's settings are becoming trivialized and underdeveloped. And even if Rain Code is a more extreme example of having darker and more mature themes, I think it still manages to illustrate what Hirogaru Sky is missing in regards to its villains and setting. So far, neither have had a strong correlation with the other, and as a result, it made any sort of conflict feel that much more minor in the grand scheme. And on top of that, the Ondargu Empire having less development than even some previous seasons as far back as the OG itself, it leaves any future interesting prospects in doubt. Now of course, they could still turn things around by maybe having a few more interesting twists, like maybe having the Kaiser and Chala be the same person. Come on, pull the trigger already, guys. And Precure series do tend to backload a lot of their plots, especially some of the more recent entries, though I really do think they need to start breaking that habit. Because as Kazutaka Kodaka and his works have shown, truly engaging stories are held up by well-developed conflicts featuring protagonists engaging with interesting antagonists and worlds. While I'm sure as hell not expecting the Empire to suddenly become an evil corporate conglomerate out of nowhere, as even the easier going Tropical Rouge and even kind of Healing Good prove, there are ways of introducing heavier topics into your show even late into its run, they just need to commit to it. Thus, while I do think this season has kind of missed the boat on making a truly great hero season by not having a consistently good rogues gallery, there is still time to turn things around with their remaining antagonists and the settings of Skyland and the Ondargu Empire and their conflicts. As I've said, Spearhead has been a good sign of things changing, and I think so far they've handled his character well, and could even do the same with the Kaiserin in spite of her severe lack of appearances. Also, small interjection from the future, but after 32, it does seem like the season scripts have been significantly rewritten in the middle of production, as evidenced by sudden changes like Minoton suddenly being replaced and the Kaiserin's change in plans. Hopefully these changes will be beneficial and won't damage an already flimsy script. Time will tell, and of course I'll hope for the best, but for now, I think I'll go back to finishing the DLCs for Rain Code, and maybe look forward to a possible sequel for that game. Seriously, I can't be the only one who wants more of Peacekeeper Hall, right? Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this uncharacteristically quickly done little analysis video after we just kind of did the Fidai review. Not gonna lie, it really does feel like the creative juices are flowing a lot easier these days, so maybe we'll even have another video out in time for the beginning of October, aka the scary month, and while Precure might have some villain problems, well, they're not sure of trauma, so we can certainly make something out of that. Also, if this video turns out to be successful, maybe we'll do a few more solo Rain Code videos. We'll see. Forward to it. And until then, though, farewell for now, my friends, and, yeah, should have figured it would run out of juice right before I'm done with my recording session.